Hey guys, I'm going to be reviewing a book today, and unless you watched the February wrap-up from last week, there's a good chance that I'm going to lose some of you because speculative fiction tends to do that with audiences. The book is From the Wreck by Jane Rawson. Also, I'm drinking / scalding myself on Earl Grey. This is her 4th novel, but it's the first time I've ever read any of her books. I read an interview to prepare for today's video, and she said that when she's not working, she's reading avidly, drinking too much, knitting, playing clarinet, hanging out with her spouse and her cats. And if you just replace cats with dogs and forget the fact that I haven't played clarinet since I was in 10th grade or so, we're basically the same person. But I have 0 writing talent. Anyway, Jane is also a huge environmentalist. She is the former editor of the Environment and Energy section of The Conversation, which is an independent news site. This book really shows her passion for environmentalism, and I love that she managed to get it across in such a unique way. I'll start with a brief premise. I won't be brief, actually. I'll start with the premise, and then I'll get into my thoughts afterward. As I said in the last video, the story starts with a sinking ship, the SS Edmella, off the coast of southern Australia. There's a steward aboard the boat. I kind of talk today. There's a steward aboard the boat named George Hills. And shortly before the sinking of the ship, he witnesses a woman engaging in some very questionable behavior down in the hold. Doesn't seem really normal. Little does he know, she has just set into motion a series of events that will lead to the sinking of the ship. Didn't do it on purpose, just happened. Lots of people die, it's really horrible, and then later, awaiting rescue, he notices that he is laying next to the woman that he calls Bridget Ledwith, which is, I suppose, the woman he witnessed in the hold, according to his co-workers. They spend the next 8 days awaiting rescue, and Bridget Ledwith manages to keep George Hills alive by some pretty gruesome means. Hint, there are some recently deceased shipwreck victims, and to waste them would be a terrible shame. After their rescue, the book jumps several years ahead into George's new life, his marriage, and the impending birth of his son. He's obviously traumatized and haunted by the shipwreck and the events that unfolded thereafter. Read cannibalism. And he does his best to quell the urge to track down this woman he calls Bridget. Actually, does he try his best? No. I guess he doesn't really try his best to quell that urge. He actually does act on that urge, but ends up with nothing. Because, spoiler, she is a shape-shifting alien. His obsession and infatuation with this woman and the trauma from the events of the shipwreck kind of consume every waking thought he has. And unbeknownst to him, this alien, she had followed him home after the wreck and took on the form of a cat to remain near him. By the way, I'm just gonna give her a female pronoun just for the sake of ease and consistency. And then during childbirth, this being forms a sort of parasitic attachment to his newborn son, who they name Henry. It forms this attachment in the form of what looks like a birthmark on the child's back, this very large, distinct birthmark. And this later leads the child, Henry, like a few years later, to refer to it as his Mark, or just Mark. After a few years, it becomes really evident that Henry, the child, is not altogether ordinary. He shares some very vague memories with something he's never experienced, memories of like oceans and underwater life. He's kind of dark and troubled in a few ways, but not in an eerie manner, he's just a bit off. George, of course, notices this, and he eventually becomes convinced that this being has something to do with it. Not that he knew it was being, but I mean, after a while, he kind of put it together. The rest of the story follows George's obsession with figuring out what this being is, how to rid himself and his family of it, and we get to watch all of these innocent individual parties at war with each other and themselves. Like I said, it's kind of a story of tension almost. The story shows 4 points of view from different chapters, the first being George Hills, the second being the sentient being that is Bridget Ledwith, aka Mark, aka the alien. The third being the son, Henry, and the fourth being a local woman named Beatrice, who finds her way into the story, and she's one of the aspects, one of the very few aspects of the story I'm having trouble reconciling. Okay, now I'll try to break it down, because trying to summarize that was a big ol' mess, and I feel like I just dug the trench really deep. From page 1, the story reads like historical fiction. The research is there, the language is period appropriate, and there's nothing remotely speculative fiction about it. At the end of George's third person perspective, we have finally set into the flow of the novel. We found our footing, we're comfortable, we get the voice, and then it's just all to hell. Immediately we're thrown into a new chapter, first person perspective, that couldn't be more starkly contrasted to George's chapter. This is the first person perspective of this extraterrestrial being, and the voice is more like a stream of consciousness than conversational. At first, it sort of reminded me of Amor McBride's style of writing, but not as disjointed. The narrative is rhythmic and lyrical, almost like poetry, and sort of like a riddle at times. For instance, the Aliens chapter begins, "I am fleet-footed fur, feeding at the fingers of my first known, my upright. This is a good life, sun on my belly in the morning, feathers and fur all scampering about, and me with my mouth full of their hot blood." After a bit more, you understand that it's the form of a cat that the alien has taken on. Like I said, shapeshifter. And I think that the author handled these sections gorgeously, which, I mean, in less capable hands would have been just a mess. The contrast between historical fiction and lyrical, almost supernatural poetry, that's an unexpected pair I've never seen before in any book, ever. What I love most about this character or being is that she's neither good or bad. She's simply lost, confused, and displaced, and she's a refugee of her previous world. She speaks of a world filled with ocean and how she was forced out along with the rest of her species by intruders that came to her planet and destroyed everything. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? While she's in the ocean, she takes on the shape of a cephalopod, so like an octopus. And that's a bit of a clever nod to her shape-shifting abilities, simply because, you know, octopi are known for camouflaging themselves to imitate other species, being able to squeeze through really tiny things. They're kind of amorphous. They can kind of mold to suit their surroundings. After the wreck and after George is released from the hospital, she follows him home and refers to him as her first known. When she initially escaped her world, she says that they tumbled through space, dimension, and time, that she ended up hiding for an unknown amount of time at the bottom of the ocean, and then when she finally came up, George was the first person she encountered. She doesn't know where the rest of her species is, she doesn't even know if they're still alive, and she is scared. She decides to stay close to George in the shape of a few life forms, but mostly a cat, and she's an innocent. She remarks through much of the book about really innocuous things that you and I accept as normal, but to an objective point of view would seem really strange. Things that humans do. I don't really have a good example. I should have found one, but it's sometimes sad, sometimes funny, usually just bizarre. And she's coming from a world on which she and her species are now extinct, and she's watching these humans make the same mistakes that she's seen before. It's a simple concept, but it's one that forces us to reconcile the facts and recognize how relevant this is to our own species. Moving on to the son, Henry, he shares a consciousness with this alien through most of the story. She shares memories like the fondness for the sea and some macabre topics. It's evident early on that Henry's not average. His father, George, realizes this and eventually puts the pieces together that this mark or influence on his son has something to do with the being that is formerly known as Bridget Ledwith, once he realizes she's not a real woman. And on top of his post-traumatic stress, he's starting to feel kind of like the grip of insanity creeping in. As far as the character Beatrice, she's kind of this older woman that enters the story, ends up working on the estate of the Hills family, but she comes to be there because her daughter has left her son in her care and just left, and so this woman Beatrice is left with her grandson and spends most of the time wondering, can she get away with sending him away? Would she be able to escape that guilt? Just feel like she's a little unnecessary to the story. She doesn't really drive the plot. She lends young Henry an ear here and there, and then later lends another person an ear, but Other than that, there's not a whole lot. I guess the main purpose of her existing in the story is to just kind of fit the theme, though it did provide that connection to the Hills family, but you wouldn't have needed that connection if she wasn't there. But I suppose if you're grasping at straws, her circumstances suit the theme of the book, which leads me to my final point. This is a story of interdependency and how we all rely on each other as species, as humans. But I guess you could take it a step further and recognize that this is also a story of isolation. George Hills existed in a time when PTSD wasn't even a recognized issue. There was no help for it. So, for instance, George was isolated because of his mental illness and his inability to connect with another being that had gone through this tragedy. And Henry is isolated because he's too mature to live a simple childhood, but too young to understand what any of it means. And Beatrice is isolated by not being isolated. She is isolated with the presence of another person because it changes her circumstance. And of course, the sentient being is isolated because she's a refugee from a different planet and time and dimension. And she is alone and afraid, but instead of being comforted, she is feared and misunderstood. And I love the clever bit of storytelling that the only person to understand her is the one that has the innocence of a child, who doesn't have these top behaviors. I originally gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, but I couldn't get it off my mind, and so I changed it to 5 out of 5. Simply because of the book's like poignancy and creativity, subject matter, the way that the author handled it. The book is currently only published in Australia, but if you live in the United States, you can get it on Kindle, unless you want to pay an inordinate amount to have it shipped to you from Australia, but I think that the Kindle option is good. Regardless of how you get your hands on it, I really hope that you buy and enjoy this book. It really is such a hidden gem. Again, I had heard of this book originally from Simon at Savage Reads. He did a review where he said he would give it 6 stars if he could, and that really piqued my interest, so I read it. I agree, it's beautiful, it's brilliant, it's refreshing, and it's extremely relevant to today's world. If you have read it or plan to read it, please say so in the comments below. Go read this book. I'll see you soon.